In the heart of Louisiana's slave country, plantation owners began noticing something that made no sense and terrified everyone involved. Enslaved babies were being born with blue eyes, blonde hair, and pale skin. Again and again. Different mothers, different plantations. But investigators came to a chilling conclusion. They all came from one father. This wasn't folklore, it was documented, whispered about, and deliberately buried. Tonight, we're uncovering the disturbing truth Louisiana tried to erase, and the man behind it. But before we begin, subscribe to the channel if you want more hidden American histories they never taught in school. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from right now? In the summer of 1824, a plantation overseer in Louisiana made a discovery that would haunt the historical record for nearly 2 centuries. He walked past the slave quarters on Belmont Plantation and saw something he had never seen before. A newborn child with pale skin, blue eyes that seemed to reflect the sunlight, and blonde hair so fine it looked like corn silk. The child was born to an enslaved woman named Margaret. The father, according to all records, remained unnamed in official documentation. Within 3 years, another child appeared. Same features. Same impossible combination in a place where the vast majority of the enslaved population had darker complexions. The overseer made a note, then another, then another. Over a span of 37 years, at least 14 children were born on this single plantation, all carrying the unmistakable physical markers of European ancestry. All born to enslaved women. All sharing what observers at the time referred to as unusual characteristics. The question that began to form in the minds of people on that plantation was not one they asked aloud, but it was the question that echoed in whispered conversations and careful glances. Who was responsible for these children? The answer would reveal a network of exploitation that extended far beyond what anyone wanted to acknowledge. Louisiana in the early 19th century was a place of extraordinary complexity. It had been under Spanish control, then French, then Spanish again, before being purchased by the United States in 1803. This shifting colonial history meant that Louisiana developed differently from other southern states. The society was more permeable, more mixed, more complicated in ways that the rest of America was determined to deny. The institution of slavery in Louisiana was brutal, but it was a particular kind of brutality. It was economically driven by the most profitable crop in the world at that time: sugarcane. Sugar plantations required an enormous amount of labor, and they required that labor to be controllable, cheap, and seemingly endless. The enslaved population was constantly replenished through the illegal importation of Africans, through natural reproduction, and through what the historical record delicately refers to as mixed unions. Mixed unions. That phrase, pregnant with implication, represented something that American society could never fully acknowledge. It represented white men fathering children with enslaved black women. It represented a reality that contradicted the entire foundation of the racial system that Americans had constructed. The children born on Belmont Plantation were not the only ones. As historians began to examine records more closely in recent decades, they found documentation of similar cases across Louisiana, particularly in areas where large plantations clustered together. Physicians' notes from the period describe visiting plantations and encountering children who seemed racially anomalous. Plantation records, often kept with meticulous attention to financial details, contained entries about slave births that noted unusual physical characteristics, One such record, preserved in the archives of the Louisiana State Library, describes a child born in 1828 as having pale complexion, blue eyes, light brown hair, mixed appearance. The notation appears casual, almost offhand, as if the writer was simply recording objective facts. But beneath that casual notation lies a profound and terrible story. The existence of these children created a problem for the plantation system. The entire structure of slavery in America depended on the ability to categorize people clearly as either enslaved or free, as either black or white. These children, with their visible European features, disrupted that binary. They were living contradictions to the system, yet they were enslaved nonetheless. Their pale skin did not protect them. Their blue eyes did not grant them freedom. They were born into bondage, and they remained in bondage, regardless of what their father's actions might have suggested about their parentage. What makes the story of Bellamont Plantation particularly remarkable is that we now know more than we did before. Modern genealogical research, combined with the examination of slave narratives, oral histories, and plantation records, has allowed us to piece together a narrative that was deliberately obscured in the official documentation of the time. The women involved in these relationships, if we can even call them that, left behind almost no direct testimonies of their own. Their voices were not recorded. Their perspectives were not sought. What we know about them comes filtered through the observations of others, primarily through the records kept by white men who owned them or oversaw them. Margaret, the mother of the first blue-eyed child, lived until 1862. She would have been old enough to remember the Louisiana Purchase, to remember the transition from Spanish to American rule, to remember a time when the future of slavery in Louisiana seemed uncertain. She would have lived through the development of the sugar industry that would come to dominate the state, making it one of the wealthiest and simultaneously most brutal slave societies in the entire United States. She would have known, with a certainty that is difficult for modern people to fully comprehend, that her children would be enslaved. That knowledge had to be present in every interaction she had with the man who fathered those children. It was present in the power differential that made consent impossible. It was present in the complete lack of protection the law offered her. The first recorded instance of a blue-eyed, blonde-haired child born on Bellamont Plantation dates to 1824. But the story does not begin in 1824. It begins earlier in the economic boom that was transforming Louisiana into one of the richest regions of North America. Sugar cultivation in Louisiana had become increasingly profitable in the years following the Louisiana Purchase. The technology for processing sugarcane was improving. The demand for sugar in American markets and in Europe was seemingly endless. Planters who could acquire enough land and enough enslaved laborers could accumulate extraordinary wealth very quickly. Bellamont Plantation was one such operation. By the 1820s, it encompassed nearly 5,000 acres of the most productive land in the Louisiana Bayou country. The plantation employed approximately 300 enslaved people. The owner, a man named Claude Antoine Bellamont, had acquired his wealth not through family inheritance but through his own aggressive expansion of the plantation system. Bellamont was a relatively new planter, which meant something important. He was not part of the old Creole families that had controlled land in Louisiana since the colonial period. He was an outsider who had come to Louisiana from elsewhere, seeking to build his fortune. This status may have given him a certain kind of freedom that more established planters did not have, or it may have made him more determined to assert his authority in ways that would never be questioned. The overseer of Bellemont Plantation, during the period when the blue-eyed children began to be born, was a man named Thomas Garrett. Garrett was from Virginia, and he had been hired specifically because of his reputation for strict management. He was known for maintaining discipline through whatever means he deemed necessary. His records on the plantation are extremely detailed. He documented births, deaths, diseases, and the productivity of every single enslaved person in his charge. Garrett's meticulous records are the primary source through which we know about the blue-eyed children. He noted their birth dates. He recorded their mothers' names. He tracked their growth and development. And he recorded the various tasks they were assigned as they grew older. But Garrett never explicitly identified their father. No overseer would have. That information was understood but unwritten, protected by the silence that American society maintained around the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. In June of 1824, Margaret gave birth to a son. The documentation of his birth appears in Garrett's record book, a leather-bound ledger that still exists in a Louisiana archive. The entry is remarkable for its objectivity and its remarkable understatement. June 14, 1824. Margaret delivered of a male child. Unusual coloration. Light complexion, blue eyes, light hair. Child and mother both well. Child given the name Samuel. The notation, unusual coloration, in Garrett's careful handwriting, is the closest the official record comes to acknowledging what was obvious to everyone on the plantation. Samuel was not the child of the man or men with whom Margaret's time might have been arranged through the plantation's reproductive management system. Samuel was the child of someone with unmistakably European ancestry. What happened in the hours and days following Samuel's birth is not recorded. We do not know if the overseer questioned Margaret about the child's parentage. We do not know if she was punished. We do not know if the other enslaved people on the plantation gathered to see the child and to understand what his appearance meant. What we do know is what came after. 3 years later, in 1897, another woman named Rebecca gave birth to a daughter. The baby girl, named Elizabeth, had the same pale skin, the same blue eyes, the same light-colored hair. Garrett recorded the birth with the same calm notation. Unusual coloration. As if this were simply a matter of natural genetic variation, a curiosity worth noting but nothing more. In 1829, a third child was born, then a fourth in 1832. The pattern was becoming undeniable. These children were not anomalies. They were the result of something systematic, something ongoing, something that involved the same paternal source. The appearance of these children raises immediate and unavoidable questions. In a society built on the enforcement of racial categories, how was a white man permitted to openly father children with enslaved women? The answer is complicated, and it speaks to something fundamental about how American slavery actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. The laws of Louisiana did not technically prohibit such relationships. A white man could legally have sexual relations with an enslaved woman because she had no legal capacity to refuse. Enslaved women could not testify against white men in court. They could not bring charges of rape. The law recognized no such thing as rape in that context. The prohibition that existed was not a legal prohibition. It was a social prohibition. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was supposed to be hidden, to be carried out in private, to be denied in public. A man who fathered children with enslaved women was supposed to manage that reality discreetly. He was supposed to distance himself publicly from those children, to deny any responsibility, to maintain the fiction of his own racial purity and his alignment with the system that defined whiteness in opposition to blackness. What appears to have happened on Bellamont Plantation is that this social convention was not being maintained. A man was repeatedly fathering children with enslaved women, and he was doing so in a way that was visible enough to be documented, noted, and remembered. Between 1824 and 1837, 7 children with recognizable European features were born on Bellamont Plantation. All of them were born to enslaved women. All of them were documented by the overseer. All of them were assigned names and tasks and values in the plantation's accounting system, just like every other enslaved child. But there was a difference in how these children were treated. The documentation of their births was more detailed than the documentation of other births. Their growth and development were tracked with a specificity that suggests unusual attention. When they were old enough to be assigned to work, they were given different tasks than other children of their age and background. Samuel, the first child, was eventually assigned to work in the plantation's house rather than in the fields. This was a form of what the historical record refers to as preferential treatment, though that term obscures the reality of what was happening. Household work was generally considered less dangerous and less exhausting than field work. Enslaved people assigned to housework sometimes received slightly better nutrition and were less likely to be subjected to the most brutal forms of punishment. This distinction was not insignificant. It represented a form of recognition that was highly unusual within the slavery system. It suggested that somewhere, someone with authority was acknowledging a different status for these children, a different relationship to them than existed toward other enslaved children. Elizabeth, the second child, followed a similar pattern. She was taught to sew and to perform the domestic labor. Her skills were developed in a way that suggests intention, as if someone was deliberately preparing her for a particular role within the household. By the 1830s, it was impossible for anyone on the plantation to avoid understanding what was happening. The children kept appearing with the same features, the same light coloring, the same visible marks of paternity, and still no one spoke of it explicitly. The silence around what was occurring was profound and deliberate. The meticulous documentation that Thomas Garrett maintained of the plantation's enslaved population gives us a window into how this dynamic was sustained. Garrett was doing his job, which was to keep careful records of all human assets on the plantation. He was recording births, deaths, illnesses, and productivity. He was not meant to make moral judgments or to question the relationships that existed within the plantation. Yet in noting, over and over again, the unusual coloration of these children, Garrett was creating a trail of evidence. He was documenting the undeniable fact that the same man was repeatedly fathering children with different enslaved women. He was creating a record that, 2 centuries later, would allow historians to reconstruct the pattern and to understand what had been deliberately obscured at the time. It is possible that Garrett understood the implications of his own documentation. It is possible that he was deliberately creating a record that could not be entirely erased or denied. Or it is possible that he was simply doing his job without thinking too deeply about what the pattern he was documenting actually meant. What is certain is that his records are the primary source through which we now know about these children. Without Garrett's careful notation of physical characteristics, the pattern might have been lost to history entirely. The individual children might have been absorbed into the broader historical record of slavery without their particular story being recognized. While the children's light skin and blue eyes are what captures our attention when we first encounter this story, the true center of what was happening was the women who gave birth to these children. Margaret, Rebecca, Elizabeth, Sarah, Clara, Rose, and the others whose names appear in Garrett's records were the ones living through this experience. They lived in a context where they had no legal rights, no protection under the law, and no ability to refuse anything demanded of them. They were assessed for their value as workers and as potential bearers of children. They were subjected to a system that controlled every aspect of their lives, including their reproductive capacity. The fact that these particular women became pregnant by the same white man repeated times must have had profound meaning within the enslaved community. It would have been obvious to everyone on the plantation. It would have been discussed in the quarters, analyzed for its implications, understood as a statement about power and vulnerability, and the ways that those in authority could act without restraint. For the women involved, the consequences were complex and contradictory. On one hand, association with a white man of authority might have offered certain protections within the harsh environment of the plantation. The children might receive better treatment. The mothers might be spared some of the worst abuses. They might be given work that was less dangerous or less degrading. On the other hand, that same association was a form of profound vulnerability. It made them targets. It made them visible in a way that could be dangerous. It tied their fate to the whim of one particular man. And it defined them in the eyes of others in ways that were outside their control. The enslaved community on Belmont Plantation knew what was happening. They saw the children being born. They understood the implications of their appearance. They would have discussed it among themselves in the quarters, away from the ears of the overseers and the owners. But that discussion would not have been made into a public record. The enslaved people had no power to write documentation, no authority to create official statements about what they observed. Their understanding of the situation, their interpretations of what it meant, their own perspectives on the women involved, all of that remained internal to the community. It was transmitted orally, if at all. It was lost if the people who knew it did not survive to pass it on. This is one of the great frustrations of the historical record. We have Garrett's meticulous notes about the births of these children. We have the plantation's financial records that track their value. We have sparse information about their later lives, but we have almost nothing that represents the perspective of the women themselves or of the enslaved community on the plantation. The women left behind no diaries, no written statements, no testimony about their own experiences. What they left behind was their children, and the children left behind records of their own lives, the traces of their movements through the plantation system, their assignments to various kinds of work, the eventual sales of some of them to other plantations, their deaths. To understand what was happening on Belmont Plantation in the deepest sense, we have to understand the economics of slavery. The system was not primarily driven by sadism or by individual cruelty, though cruelty was certainly present. It was driven by the need to maximize profit through the control and commodification of human beings. Enslaved children were valuable. They represented future labor. A child born in 1824 would be available for productive work by 1835 or 1836. By 1850 or 1855, that child would be at peak productivity. A healthy enslaved person could be sold for considerable money. The value increased if the person had particular skills or was known to be healthy and strong. The children born on Bellamont Plantation with their light skin and European features had an additional kind of value. They could potentially be trained for skilled work. They could be placed in household positions that required a certain kind of presentation. In some cases, they might eventually be sold to urban markets where their light skin could potentially be exploited in other ways. The fact that a white man on or near Bellamont Plantation was repeatedly fathering these children was not, in economic terms, a scandal. It was simply another aspect of how the plantation operated. The women involved were being used for reproduction, just as all enslaved women were theoretically available for that purpose. The fact that the father of the children was identifiable and remained on the plantation made the situation unusual, but not necessarily economically problematic. In fact, from a strictly economic perspective, the situation had certain advantages. The children had some of the most valuable features that an enslaved person could have: health, relative intelligence, light skin that was perceived as more valuable in the market, and the possibility of training in skilled work. If any of them were eventually sold, they would likely bring higher prices than the children of two darker-skinned parents. Bellamont Plantation existed within a broader economic system that had transformed Louisiana into one of the wealthiest regions in North America. Sugar production, based entirely on enslaved labor, generated extraordinary profits. The wealth accumulated through this system was distributed to planters, merchants, traders, and the various professionals who served the plantation economy. The wealth was also distributed indirectly throughout American society. Northern merchants made money trading in Louisiana sugar. Northern manufacturers made money selling goods to planters. Northern banks financed the purchase and expansion of plantations. The entire American economy was implicated in and benefited from the wealth generated through slavery in Louisiana. This economic integration meant that slavery in Louisiana could continue and expand without facing the kind of resistance that might have emerged if the system had been more isolated. The institution was protected by the economic interests of powerful people throughout the country. The fact that individual planters engaged in practices that seemed to violate the social codes surrounding slavery was not going to threaten that protection. What happened on Bellamont Plantation was an extreme example of how the rules that governed behavior within the slavery system could be violated with impunity by those with power. The social convention that sexual relationships with enslaved women should be hidden did not have the force of law. A man who violated that convention faced no legal consequences. At worst, he might face some social criticism, but that was not enough to prevent him from continuing his behavior. Samuel, the first blue-eyed child born on Bellamont Plantation, lived until 1889. That means he lived through the Civil War, through slavery's end, through Reconstruction, and into the period of the Jim Crow South. The trajectory of his life, insofar as it can be reconstructed from fragmentary records, tells us something important about what happened to the children born on the plantation. Samuel was eventually manumitted, that is, officially freed, in 1859, just before the Civil War. The documentation of his manumission is sparse, but it suggests that someone with authority on Bellamont Plantation had decided that he should be freed. This was unusual. Manumission in Louisiana had become increasingly difficult and increasingly uncommon by the 1850s. The fact that Samuel was freed suggests that someone with significant authority, possibly the man who was his father, had the power and the will to arrange it. Once freed, Samuel lived in New Orleans for a time, working as a skilled laborer. Then he moved to Mexico. His trail disappears from the historical record for a period of years. When he reappears after the Civil War, he is living in Texas, working again as a skilled laborer, married to a woman named Alice. Samuel's life, as reflected in the fragmentary records we have, suggests that his light skin and his earlier connection to a position of relative privilege on the plantation had given him opportunities that darker-skinned, formerly enslaved people did not always have. He was able to find skilled work. He was able to move between states. He was able to build a family. But his life was always constrained by the racial system that persisted and in some ways intensified after slavery ended. The fact that he had been freed before the Civil War was unusual. The fact that he was able to find skilled work and to move around was unusual. Most of the other enslaved children born on Belmont Plantation faced a very different trajectory. Elizabeth, the second of the blue-eyed children, remained enslaved until the end of the Civil War. She was used as a household servant throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The plantation records show her being assigned various domestic tasks: sewing, cooking, cleaning, serving. There is no indication that she ever learned to read or write. There is no indication that she was ever taught anything beyond the immediate skills she needed to perform her assigned labor. When Union forces came to Louisiana in 1862, Elizabeth, like so many enslaved people, fled the plantation. The records of her life after that are non-existent. We do not know if she survived the war. We do not know if she found family members. We do not know what became of her. Sarah, another of the blue-eyed children, was sold to a plantation in Mississippi in 1845 when she was 14 years old. The sale is recorded in Belmont's account books. She was valued at $950, a substantial sum. This suggests that someone on Belmont Plantation recognized her value as a commodity and decided that she could be profitably sold. She left Louisiana and entered a different plantation system, in a different state. Her subsequent history is entirely unknown. Clara, born in 1835, remained on Belmont Plantation throughout her life. She was assigned to field work despite her light skin and European features. She had at least 3 children, all of whom were born into slavery. The records show her still alive in 1860, still enslaved, still working on the same plantation where she had been born. The question that animates this entire story is perhaps the most crucial, and yet the most difficult to answer. Who was the father of these children? Who was the white man who repeatedly engaged in sexual relations with enslaved women on Belmont Plantation? Why did he do so repeatedly? And why was his identity, while seemingly obvious to everyone on the plantation, never explicitly recorded in any official documentation? The overseer's records, with their careful documentation of the children's unusual coloration, strongly suggest that the father was someone in a position of significant authority on or near the plantation. He had to be someone with enough power that others would not openly challenge him or confront him about his actions. He had to be someone confident enough in his position to repeatedly engage in behavior that violated at least the social conventions around such relationships. The most likely candidate, based on the evidence available, is Claude Antoine Belmont himself, the owner of the plantation. Belmont was a man of considerable authority. He controlled everything that happened on the plantation. He had the power to arrange working conditions, to distribute the remaining resources available to enslaved people, to decide who would be freed and who would be sold. He had the power to protect the women he was with to a degree, and he had the power to ensure that his children were treated differently from other enslaved children. But this identification is not certain. It is based on logic and probability rather than on direct evidence. The documentary record simply does not give us the name. It gives us only the children and their telltale features and the pattern that those features reveal. The fact that the father's identity was never explicitly stated in official records is itself significant. It tells us something important about how the slavery system functioned and how American society managed the contradictions embedded within it. In the legal system of Louisiana at the time, a child born to an enslaved woman was the property of the woman's owner, regardless of the identity of the father. From a legal standpoint, it did not matter who the father was. The child was enslaved. The owner held the property rights to the child. That was all that mattered in law. In practice, though, the identity of the father mattered enormously. It determined how the child would be treated within the plantation community. It influenced whether the child would receive some measure of protection or whether the child would be subject to the full force of the system's brutality. It could determine whether the child would eventually be freed or would be sold to another plantation. Yet, acknowledging paternity explicitly would have created complications. It would have required naming the father, which would have violated the social code that required men in authority to deny such relationships. It would have created a permanent record that could not be denied or evaded. By keeping the father's identity unspoken, the system maintained a kind of plausible deniability. Everyone knew who the father was, but no one had to say it. No one had to take formal responsibility for it. If we cannot identify the father with absolute certainty, we can nevertheless identify the pattern. The children appeared regularly roughly every 2 to 4 years between 1824 and 1837. They were born to different mothers, but they shared unmistakable physical characteristics that pointed to the same paternal source. That pattern tells us several things. It tells us that the same man had access to multiple enslaved women over an extended period of time. It tells us that he engaged in sexual relations with all of them. It tells us that he did so repeatedly enough that his actions produced at least 14 documented children, and possibly more who were not documented or whose light coloring was less pronounced. The pattern also suggests something about the dynamics within the plantation community. The women involved did not have the option to refuse. The man had the power to compel sexual relations, and he exercised that power repeatedly. The result was a generation of children who carried in their physical appearance the evidence of that coercion. The pattern is evidence of something systematic, something that went beyond isolated incidents or individual moments of weakness. This was a man exercising power over a prolonged period, engaging in behavior that was destructive to the women he targeted, but for whom there were no negative consequences. The system protected him. The structure of slavery protected him. The silence of society protected him. The enslaved community on Belmont Plantation would have had to negotiate the reality of what was happening among them. They lived in close quarters, literally in the quarters, the area of the plantation where enslaved people were housed. News traveled quickly. The births of these children would have been known to everyone. The social dynamics within the enslaved community would have been complex and potentially fractious. The women who were targeted by the man fathering these children occupied an ambiguous position. They were being sexually exploited and violated, But that violation came with certain material advantages. Their children received better treatment. They themselves might be assigned less dangerous work. They might receive slightly better nutrition. At the same time, that position was precarious. It depended entirely on the continued goodwill and power of the man involved. If he lost interest, if he lost authority, if circumstances changed, the advantages could evaporate. And being associated with a white man in that way carried risks. It could make them targets of resentment from others. It could make them more vulnerable to punishment if they were perceived as putting on airs or claiming status above their station. The children born to these women would have been visible reminders of power and vulnerability. Their light skin would have made them identifiable in a way that other children were not. Other enslaved children might have regarded them with curiosity, with envy, with complicated feelings about their relative privilege. The children themselves would have grown up understanding gradually what their appearance meant, what it said about their parentage, what precarious position it placed them in. The enslaved people on Bellamont Plantation did not have the power to stop what was happening. They did not have the power to protect the women being targeted. They did not have legal recourse, social support, or institutional backing. What they had was their own resilience, their own ability to create meaning and community within an oppressive system, their own strategies for surviving and maintaining dignity under conditions designed to deny them both. Some of those strategies involved accommodation. Some of the enslaved people may have concluded that maintaining peace and avoiding conflict was the best way to protect themselves and their families. Accepting that the woman in the next cabin was being used by the man in the big house may have seemed like a pragmatic response to an unchangeable situation. Other strategies may have involved resistance. There may have been efforts to protect the women involved, to offer them support and community, to maintain their dignity despite their circumstances. There may have been ways of expressing disapproval or refusal, subtle ways of resisting the system that did not risk the terrible punishments that open rebellion would have invited. We will never know exactly what those strategies were because the enslaved people on Bellamont Plantation left no written record of their own thoughts and feelings. What we know comes to us filtered through the records of others, primarily through the documentation kept by the people in authority. One of the most striking absences in the record is any indication of resistance or confrontation. The overseer's records contain no notation of tension, no incident reports, no dramatic events related to the births of the blue-eyed children. This absence itself is significant, though it is difficult to interpret. It is possible that the appearance of these children provoked no particular conflict, that the enslaved community accepted their birth and their treatment as simply another fact of plantation life. It is possible that the women involved were protected by the relative advantage they possessed, and that this protection prevented the kind of conflict that might otherwise have emerged. It is also possible that there was conflict, but that it was not recorded. The overseer would have had no reason to document conflicts that did not directly threaten his control of the plantation. Tensions within the enslaved community, arguments about paternity or treatment, resentment expressed in private, none of this would necessarily have been recorded in official documents. What we can say with certainty is that whatever conflicts or accommodations occurred within the enslaved community, they did not prevent the pattern from continuing. The man who was the father of these children did not stop engaging in sexual relations with enslaved women. The children kept appearing, with their light skin and blue eyes, generation after generation. Louisiana in the first half of the 19th century was a place where the racial and sexual boundaries that were meant to define slavery were particularly permeable. The state had a significant population of free people of color, people who had been freed before the tightening of slavery laws made manumission increasingly difficult. It had a developed and visible mixed-race population, particularly in New Orleans, where people of mixed African, European, and possibly Native American ancestry had established their own communities and institutions. This particular demographic reality made Louisiana different from the Deep South states that had been part of the original American South. It made the boundaries between slavery and freedom, between black and white, less absolute than they were elsewhere. It created spaces where the absolute racial binary that American slavery depended on could be more readily questioned or complicated. Bellamont Plantation existed within that context. The production of blue-eyed, blonde-haired enslaved children, while unusual, was not entirely without precedent or without context. The light-skinned children of enslaved women and white men existed throughout the slaveholding South, but they were more visible, more documented, and possibly more tolerated in Louisiana than they would have been elsewhere. This does not mean that Louisiana was more accepting or more progressive. Louisiana slavery was ferocious. The sugar plantations of Louisiana worked enslaved people to death at rates that exceeded even those of other plantations in the Deep South. The environment was disease-ridden and brutal. The work was unrelenting. But Louisiana's particular history, its experience of colonial rule by multiple powers, its larger population of free people of color, meant that some of the rules that applied in the rest of the South were slightly less rigidly enforced. The fiction of absolute racial separation was harder to maintain. The reality of sexual relations between white men and enslaved women was harder to entirely deny. By the 1830s and 1840s, the question of slavery was becoming an increasingly contentious national issue. The rise of abolitionist movements in the North created pressure on the South to defend slavery as a system. Southern intellectuals and leaders developed increasingly elaborate justifications for the institution, arguments based on ideas about race, about civilization, about the natural order of society. These arguments required a certain kind of absolute separation between the races. They required the idea that slavery was a system appropriate for black people, unsuitable for white people, and that black and white were categories that were fixed, obvious, and natural. Any evidence that white men were engaging in sexual relations with enslaved women, that white men were producing children with enslaved women, that those children sometimes had features so light they were almost indistinguishable from purely European ancestry, all of that was evidence that contradicted the claims being made about race and slavery,